Welcome to Establish the Edge, not only for this episode, but for a weekly series through the NFL Draft. I'm your host, John Daigle, joined today by the Director of Projections here at ETR, Mike Leone, the man running the best ball streets in all of our rankings right now, and Justin Hergitzig, and the person getting yelled at for being a point off in the Dynasty calculator every now and then, Anthony Amico. And we are here today, boys, for a very big episode, as I mentioned, to begin with the 2025 rookie class and how it pertains to best ball. So, Leone, I think it's a good place to start and explaining to everyone why rookies are even valuable.
Yeah, rookies, it's always a hot topic each year. And I think the people that are pro rookie sometimes get painted with a brush indicating that they have rose-colored glasses on. But there's a reason why, typically the ETR ranks are pro rookie, and a lot of the sharper players out there are trying to mix rookies into their portfolio. And that's because there's so much uncertainty with rookies. And as a result of that uncertainty, those are the guys that have the most profit potential, that can pay off, a 6th round ADP by multiple rounds, be drafted in first, second round next year. That doesn't happen with veterans a whole lot, unless you get a situation where a vet has a quarterback change, coaching change, going to a different team. For the most part, we know who those players are. We know their circumstances, and they might have good or bad years that deviate a little bit from what's expected, but their cost is a little bit more appropriate. Whereas the rookies, there's a chance we look back in hindsight and see these costs as egregiously mispriced. Now, don't mistake that for thinking you should go crazy on all rookies. Price definitely still super important here. Certain guys get hyped up too much where the risk reward isn't worth it. And again, big time profit potential doesn't mean a high hit rate too. Those are very different things. So you can profit a ton off a single player, but that doesn't mean lots of rookies are going to hit and pay off their ADP. In fact, quite often it's the opposite in terms of the percentage of rookies that hit.
And we'll dive into those ADPs at each position shortly, Herzig, but we are already seeing an increase in some cost post-combine. That includes the biggest riser, underdog, actually, at any position over the last few days in North Carolina's Amari and Hampton. And it's only going to become more dramatic with rookies until the draft. So is there a macro approach you're taking at this time to handle the projected swings we are expected to endure through April?
Yeah, and I mean, because as Leone mentioned, that uncertainty is where the rookies have that biggest upside. And I kind of see it as two perspectives. One is you can get immediate value and closing line value in the contest, because before the combine, we didn't have as much information. More information comes out, we see the movement. Then what was going to happen? We're going to have the draft. And the draft, now we'll see the landing spots. Those contests are closed. But if you consider from, hey, where your closing line value was when you drafted them to the end of summer, you can get substantial closing line value there. Then the next is actually in the season, rookies still have the widest range of outcomes, because even once we know their landing spot and their potential role, how they perform, what role they actually have in that offense, how they're going in the playoffs when, we see the Bucky Irving, we see this kind of meteoric rise when you get that role. That's where these rookies, what we're drafting now, have that upside. So someone like when we're talking about the running backs, you're talking about Omari and Hampton. Yeah, people liked him from a scouting aspect. He was probably in that group between running back 2 to 5. But then the combine comes, we get more information. We see him having a great speed score, overall RAS. And there's general managers that they're talking about that some of them like him actually as their top running back on the board ahead of Ashton Jeanty. So I think those two have really shown themselves to be the clear 1-2. But there's still, beyond that, this is a really deep running back class, and there's lots of guys we can really get into.
And we will get to that deep class, but I do want to begin at the top, Amico, with quarterbacks, because in short, guys who are drafted high, we are naturally going to shove starts in our projections. We're expecting them to play, and that includes, among this class, those who we are confident in being drafted highly in Cam Ward, and then those behind him who we think have a terrific chance to land not too far behind him in the first round, and Shedeur Sanders, Jackson Dart, and for the sake of conversation, I'm going to throw Louisville's Tyler Shaw in there as well. So how those fringe first rounders then become valuable QB2s for fantasy, similar to Jaden Daniels' outlook last year, and why they were being drafted as QB2s, like Daniel was at this time last season, is because of their rushing floors. The passing is what allowed Daniels to reach his ceiling in fantasy, but the floor was always going to make him valuable, assuming he was going to be a top 5, top 10 pick for us in best ball. So is there anyone that profiles as that style of runner that should be on our radar in this year's class?
So it's like a split answer to your question, because I
Sure.
think that the guy that would most represent that kind of rushing potential will be Jalen Milroe, who is not even one of the guys you mentioned. And the reason you didn't mention him is because he's probably not going to play. Like, he's most likely going to be a day 2 pick. Like, I think that for him to get on the field, it would take an injury, maybe 2 injuries, depending on where he is. So you're going to get those starts later in the year, which is good. Like, that's usually kind of the upside on the rookie QBs. But I think his potential for starts is really, really low. If we're talking about who is the best runner out of the guys that we think will go like in the top 35 picks, then I would say Jackson Dart is the guy, because he's in that Drake May style of rusher where he's going to be able to scramble and make plays outside the pocket. He's not really looking to run.
Herzig, you've been playing best ball this long, going back to the old school streets of draft. And so I know you were in the lobbies whenever the Jalen Milroe type player and Jalen Hurts was available in best ball. Was he an afterthought? Was he not drafted, since he obviously did not start until the last month anyhow? Or was he someone, if you recall off the top of your head, that was actually being drafted?
Yeah, I would guess he was not really drafted. And a lot of the thought behind it is it's really difficult to take a 0 at the quarterback position. And even if we look at it right now in kind of the landscape, when you have Shedeur Sanders and Jackson Dart that are like, the more we're hearing about the Shedeur Sanders dropping such, and then the Jackson Dart being maybe a late first, there's a decent chance that majority of that season you're taking 0s. And if you want to say, hey, we have 20 rounds now, yes, you can take those chances. But the challenge is that even when you get the upside, very rarely at the QB position do you actually differentiate that much from the rest of the field, that upside isn't worth the risk of those 0s. And for this year, you can look at guys that are going around Shedeur Sanders. You've got Matthew Stafford, who's locked in to play every game this year, barring an injury. You've got other guys that are highly likely to be playing most of the year, like Geno Smith, Sam Darnold. And so when I'm comparing those, I'd much rather take probably a similar upside, but a ton less risk. And then, yeah, maybe Jackson Dart does have a bit more upside because of his rushing aspect. But again, the chance of how many 0s you're going to have to weather, and then even if you do get him into the playoffs, what are the chances he really can put up a 35 burger to really differentiate at the position? It's unlikely. You're more likely just going to get, at best, a 25, maybe 30 out of it. And how much different is that really from the other 2 or 3 quarterbacks you'd be drafting?
In that case, what kind of builds do you find yourself then targeting guys like Sanders, Dart, and Shao? Because they could still end up in the Drake May situation, where Drake May was being drafted in the last couple of rounds last year. And although we did not expect him to start the first month of the season behind a veteran, he still finished as the QB 15 in points per game. He still paid off that value at the end of drafts. So how are you handling those type of guys?
Yeah, and to be fair, like going into a Drake May was a much better rusher than Jackson Dart. Like, even though we probably didn't truly see it at the NFL level, I still think he has that skill set. And in college at UNC, like he was getting tremendous touchdowns. I think I don't remember the exact number now, but he had a ton of rushing touchdowns there. And so I think we were expecting a bit more upside from Drake May. QB 15, what is it? QB 15 in points per game.
And it's 10 full starts, yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't differentiate at the position. And so taking that at the end of draft, when an 18th round draft pick versus a 14th round draft pick, when you're comparing who else is available at that position, it's pretty much a coin flip anyways when you're talking about running backs and wide receivers and tight ends. But at the quarterback position, if in the 14th round I can get someone who has a high floor and and the upside is not that much different than the other guys I'm taking with these very low floors, in these current builds with 20 rounds, I do like to take 3 quarterbacks. But I don't want to take quarterbacks that I think there's substantial risk that they won't be starting both at the beginning of the season and the end of the season.
Do you believe there's an early edge to correlate stacking projections, Leone? Something like Cam Ward with Jerry Jeudy if he were to be drafted by the Browns, or Malik Neighbors, for example?
I mean, I don't think it hurts, but it's not something I'd go out of my way to try and do. It's just such a difficult prognostication to make and to get right that it's not, in my opinion, giving up draft capital to make it happen. So if it happens at ADP, if you're going to like the player anyways, we know stacking is super important in best ball, and you might get some more unique combos because other people aren't trying to make these stacks. But for the most part, it's not something I would prioritize.
I want to move on to running back because I know we're going to have a long discussion here. And I want to come back to you, Leone, because draft capital, as we know, the most correlated to fantasy points in year one for rookie running backs. But that's only easy to identify at the top of the position, which this year is in a vacuum alone, Ashton Jeanty. It gets murky beyond that because then we're attempting to project guys from day 2 on. So your thoughts on attempting to correlate that with the next group of guys?
Yeah, so if you look at just eyeballing like the past 5 years of draft classes as the way the NFL has evaluated the running back position has changed, the guys who are like top 50 to 60 picks, you look at that list, it's highly likely that those guys are very fantasy relevant year 1 or year 2 of their careers. When you start moving past that, though, it's not like a linear thing, in my opinion. It starts to get really dicey. Sometimes comparing, a late 3rd round pick to an early 5th round pick, you're not going to squeeze a whole lot out of there in terms of draft capital. So I think when you start getting to those guys that don't make that top 50, 60 picks, I think you want to hone in on making like the upside, very optimistic case. Like it's very easy to poke holes in any of these rookies. So you think of guys like Achane, who had elite speed. Isaiah Pacheco is another example a couple years ago where people were really worried about this pretty dreadful college production from him, but he had speed, had a good landing spot with the Kansas City Chiefs, and that's where you kind of just made that bull case. You're going to miss on the majority of these guys, but I do think like focusing on one aspect of the player that you can really make this upside case for is more important than poking holes about the overall profile. And I think you're probably better off making these guys later round dart throws as opposed to, there's a big difference, I guess, between taking a stab in the 10th to 13th round in the best ball drafts versus the 14th to the 18th rounds. And we've seen situations the past few years, even post NFL draft, where guys like, Isaiah Spiller, Tyrion Davis-Price, Marshawn Lloyd, etc. We really just overvalue these guys that are the earlier like 3rd round picks who we like, but their job security is not what we think they are. We just sort of assume the rookie's going to come in, be number 2 on the depth chart. That's not always what happens. So I think your profit potential is a little bit better, honestly, just waiting and taking some of the 4th, 5th round picks that end up in good spots or just have a really good aspect to their profile.
And I know Amico will have some of those round 14 through 18 guys to discuss for us, but I do want to slow down for a second because Jeanty is being drafted right now at the 2nd, 3rd round turn in the same tier as, like himself, potential overall RB1s, Devon Achane, Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey. So right now, Herzig, how do you typically find yourself handling that tier of running backs, Jeanty included?
Yeah, and I'm going to say he's actually the 1-2 turn. His ADP is like
at the 2nd
right
3.
now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so, I mean, it is an expensive price tag. And if you look at the comps from previous years, you get the guys like Bijan, like if we're talking the draft capital, which is top 10, top 12 of the NFL draft, there's a lot of things to like in there. What scares me, though, is, and maybe this is more the way the NFL is changing and teams are valuing running back, teams are valuing the kind of explosiveness that you can get. I think there's a couple just risky landing spots right now that for me personally, and if you look at the UTR ranks, we have them a little behind the guys like Devon Achane and Christian McCaffrey. But if you want to be taking him and you want that upside, like you've got to make that reach. And I think after the NFL draft, 75%, 80% of the landing spots are where he's going to be the workhorse. He's going to have both the pass catching, the goal line, and that 3-down work, and he probably will pay off. And come summer, we'll probably be drafting him at the back end of the 1st round. But for right now, I still think there's that 25 to 30% where maybe the Colts do take him. Maybe he ends up going to a team where it's a long-term, where it's more of the long-term play. And in that year one, he actually shares the workload a little. And that scares me a little. It scares me enough that I'm not willing to take him over a Christian McCaffrey, over a Devon Achane. There's even a couple wide receivers in that area that I like a little more too. But that's how I'm currently thinking about the kind of Ashton situation.
It is similar to Jameer Gibbs' outlook, where whenever we reach Vegas in August, then suddenly, that was season long, but suddenly at the first, second round turn, that's exactly where Gibbs was going as well. Amico, the easiest question I'll ask you on the show all afternoon, your micro thoughts on Ashton Jeanty as a player.
I mean, he's awesome, right? Like, I mean, this is the Bijan. This is the, no doubt about it. Just he's gonna plug in and do his thing. I mean, I don't really have any doubts about where he's gonna go. That he's gonna be the guy. It's kind of a matter of like, is that situation gonna be conducive to fantasy points, like Herzig was saying.
What about the fringe first round guys that are getting some buzz right now, and those honestly who have landed in the dead zone of best ball drafts in rounds 4 through 7, and Amarian Hampton, Quinshawn Judkins, and Travion Henderson?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think that Hampton should be closer to Jeanty than he is right now. I mean, he's RB17 and Jeanty's RB5. Like, I feel like their actual NFL draft position is going to end up being closer than that. And this is their running back ADP being pretty far apart. So, Hampton seems to be the guy that some people are saying somewhere that they would take ahead of Jeanty. I don't necessarily think that would happen, but he has the 3-down skill set. If he's gonna be the first round pick, which right now I'd say seems pretty likely. There's just a lot of volume that comes with that right away. So, I think he should be going much higher. He's definitely the guy that I like the most out of that group that you mentioned.
It's early in the process, Herzig, so we'll have more than enough months to debate what the actual dead zone is. But those guys I just mentioned are being drafted around Alvin Kamara, James Conner, David Montgomery. The list goes on. Guys, we have question marks for their surrounding usage. So what are you doing with that tier of players and those rookies right now?
Yeah, I think the overall macro, how are we approaching the running back position right now? I think, yes, there's a lot of rookie running backs that you can be drafting, and where they go, we can debate. I think what we can't debate is the impact this is going to have on the veteran running backs this year. No veteran running back is safe. And I'm talking all the way up to like first rounders, Devon Achane and Christian McCaffrey, because who knows, maybe one of these teams decides we want to draft one of these and we get more of a complementary style role. But when we look at the third, fourth round, you've got Chase Brown, you've got Joe Mixon. Bengals are already talking about that they want a complementary back for Chase Brown. Joe Mixon, I mean, he's a workhorse back. If he doesn't have that full backfield to himself, there's no way he pays off that value. Alvin Kamara is aging. Then you get to the next year. You get Tyrone Tracy, Jalen Warren, Ramondre, DeAndre Swift. Like, all of these guys are veterans that there's enough high-quality running backs that are going to go day 2 or maybe in that 4th round that can have an immediate impact. And in this day, like, we care about the workhorse. We care about the value when we don't have the level of talent and efficiency. And when you're talking about, hey, Tyrone Tracy, I think he was a 6th round draft pick. Ramondre, like, how special are we still talking? We know Swift has his issues. These are the guys that I am scared to draft now. And if you look at the ETR ranks, I believe we're below ADP on just about all of them.
And Leone already mentioned when to take these rookie running back shots, rounds 15 through 18. And right now, Amico, in that range, the players going are RJ Harvey, DJ Giddens, Rashad Smith, Damian Martinez, LaQuint Allen. Anyone among that group stand out, or someone I didn't mention?
I really like Harvey. I think that he's in that like Tracy type mold, not in the sense that he's a converted receiver, just in terms of the explosion. Like, he's going to come on the field, he's going to be able to catch passes, he's going to attack, the sidelines of a defense, and he's going to make big plays. Like, that's kind of what you want in a complimentary back. I like Giddens as a guy that's a little bit bigger and can produce, maybe not in like a traditional 3-down type spot, but in a 1A, 1B type situation where he can still score some touchdowns. So those are the 2 guys that I would say in that range I like the most. Brashard Smith is also in that range, and that's kind of like the I mean, that's the Tracy like 1-to-1 clone in the sense that he is a converted receiver. He ran a sub 4.4 at the combine. I think his stock is climbing pretty rapidly. So, that's a guy that I could see after the draft being selected, in like round 12, and he's going significantly later than that right now.
There may not actually be a hard answer to this, Herzig, but do you find yourself building in a particular way with rookie running backs? Is there a point where they become oversaturated in your 4 to 6 RB builds?
My most common build right now is Hero RB because I see there's so few that I can feel confident are truly going to have that great role going into the season, that a lot of my teams are starting off with Saquon or Bijan or Gibbs, or for me, it's McCaffrey. I include HM, but I accept that there's some risk there. And then after that, I'll kind of stay away from the other veteran running backs for a while and either mix in some of these running backs like Hampton, Henderson, Judkins, Sampson, where I know what I'm getting. I know what the potential upside is, accepting the risk, and then sprinkling a lot of those other running backs later on. Because as we're saying, like, yeah, some of those are going to be duds, but some of them are going to find themselves. And we look at the RJ Harvey, the DJ Giddens, you look at their projected draft capital, it's not much different than what Bucky Irving was. And Bucky Irving, like, also had that horrible combine and everything. So if we want to just say, like, hey, from a pure prospect, a lot of these guys are going to have similar draft capital, are going to look like great players, but they're not going to know until the position. We're not going to know until the competition of who they have to beat out. So yeah, give me a sprinkling, I would say, and then really just trying to avoid a lot of these veterans.
Moving on to wide receivers, the correct cliche, not just a cliche, Leone, is that rookie wide receivers emerge in the second half of the year, but targeting that draft capital at such a vast and widely drafted position is obviously much easier in post-draft best ball when we know the draft capital. So is there a way to intelligently take on that second half upside pre-draft? And at what point does drafting multiple rookie wide receivers become diminishing?
Yeah, I think there's a few things you can do. One, pay attention to what guys like Anthony Amico say, JJ Zacharyson, who do great prospect stuff pre-draft. There's resources out there too to really pin down. You can check the props market, mock draft database, like get the consensus big board to kind of try and figure out where guys are going to go, because we do know that the draft capital, especially at the top, really heavily correlates with rookie year target share, and targets are the most important thing at the position. One thing that I'd note about wide receivers, I think when you're building a room in best ball, it's important to kind of diversify your wide receiver room. If you go crazy rookie heavy, you're going to get killed the first half of the season where these guys aren't producing right away. You're also, again, you're probably going to have a lot of misses mixed in there, and you're going to have a really fragile profile. If you don't take any rookies, you might start with a squad that's completely healthy, guys that have starting positions but aren't the best players, and you might get off to a good start, but you don't have those league winners or those spike weeks at the tail end of the season when it's most important for best ball. So trying to be cognizant of that when you make your room, mixing in like 2 or 3 rookies and really trying to do that but not going overboard, I think makes a lot of sense. And I wouldn't, it's hard pre-draft because so much of this is post-draft, but last year we didn't have a lot of rookie wide receivers late that made an impact, but in years prior we have. You look at Puka Nacua, Tank Dell, and similar to the point I made about rookie running backs, I do think when you get in those 15th to 18th rounds, zoning in on the bullish case you can make for the player makes sense. And early on when you're drafted in 4th to the 6th round, you can nitpick the cases of the receivers. Like, you're worried about the floor, you need some immediate production. But when you get in those late ends, I think focusing more on the upside case that you can make makes sense. I know this is pre-draft, but I would say post-draft too, just like not overreacting to the landing spots. We saw some overreaction with like Brian Thomas last year, which made him an incredible value. I think, even though it didn't work out with Rome Odunze, again, the point about draft capital, like you should be really anchored to where the NFL thinks these guys are going to go. In fact, we've seen that, oddly enough, athleticism at the wide receiver position sometimes doesn't matter in the sense that it's already encapsulated so much in just where these players are being taken. So just keep that in mind.
I'm glad you mentioned that 4 through 7 round range for best ball, because this year, despite the fact that we will get first round wide receivers, there is no Marvin Harrison or Malik Neighbors Herzig in drafts. So far, the earliest rookie wide receivers being drafted are Tetero McMillan in the 4th round, Luther Burden in the 6th, and 7th rounders Emeka Ibuka and Matthew Golden. So how are you handling that tier of players?
Yeah, and from a NFL draft capital, we expect all of those to go in the first round. Matthew Golden kind of ran his way with a 40-yard dash into that first round profile. I think at a high level, the way that I'm approaching normally with these pre-draft best ball contests for running back and wide receiver position, I mentioned running back. I love taking a bunch because as we were talking about with the RJ Harvey example, he lands as a round 3 to the Raiders or to the Chargers, and that's their running back. His capital can skyrocket. But wide receivers, even if you get that perfect landing spot, we have a little more information on their talent. And the guys like Brian Thomas that are able to have those huge, second half of the year, those are still first round wide receivers. And that means in draft for our best ball drafts, we're still taking those in those rounds 5, 6, 7, where the running backs, you might have a Bucky Irving who would be going in the rounds 15, 16, 17, and then ends up having that huge season. So I think it is worth noting that when I think about how I'm approaching wide receiver position in best ball, I'm actually not as bullish on rookies before the NFL draft. You also need to account for, we know how important stacking is. Should I take a wide receiver that's going around these guys? Let's say, hey, around Emeka Ibuka, you have someone like Deebo Samuel. I can either know that I'm getting my Deebo Samuel, Jaden Daniels stack, or I can hope that maybe I do. So every rookie you take, you're highly unlikely to stack that person, and that does hurt your team in the end. And when you combine with the other thing, you don't have nearly as much upside with the later round guys as we do with the running backs because it's so much dependent upon position. So to get directly to your question for those 4 guys, I would say I am sprinkling them in. But a lot of the time when I look at other wide receivers around those, I see someone like, Juwan Jennings. I see someone like Ricky Pearsall, and I know I can go grab Brock Purdy a couple rounds later and get that stack. And am I confident that Emeka Ibuka versus Juwan Jennings? I don't know. That's probably a coin flip on who actually produces better, who actually has the higher upside. But at least I know that I can get Brock Purdy for my stack rather than guessing on where Ibuka is going to land to catch that stack.
Similar to Jeanty as a key discussion in the early rounds, I personally think the most polarizing conversation in ADP and all of best ball pre-draft right now is Travis Hunter. So Amico, I want you to discuss Travis Hunter as a prospect a little bit because obviously the last 2 years played virtually every snap at wide receiver and cornerback. And although he's projected to be the first quote unquote wide receiver drafted in the NFL this year, his ADP right now is in the 10th round at underdog.
Yeah, I mean, he's the best receiver in the draft. I think that's been the consensus coming out of the combine. That's what people are saying. He's the best corner and he's the best receiver. So the talent, I don't think, is in question. I know that we're talking a little bit about the prospect profile. Devonta Smith is kind of like that wheelhouse type of player for him. Lad McConkey, he's a really, really good wide receiver. So, the question is really just how much is he going to play? Now, I think that there's obviously a lot of debate over this, but I think that there's been some debate among teams where it's it's really hard to find shutdown corners, so maybe we'll play him more as a corner. Well, if you ask Hunter, he wants to play receiver. He's like, if you're going to make me play something more, I want to play receiver. Now, among the reasons that is the case, I have to imagine that the financial impact is biggest, right? He's going to make more money if he's catching passes versus if he's stopping other people from catching passes. Jamar Chase is going to make $45-50 million a year when all is said and done. There's not money like that at corner. So, I think that I think it makes the most sense for him, but I think he's going to play receiver. I think he's going to be out there a lot. I think that even if he's not out there, maybe in year one, a team that drafts him really wants him at corner. He's still going to play 40% of the offensive snaps, and when he's on the field, he's going to get the ball. It's not like these other guys where we're questioning the talent and we're unsure if the football is going to come their way. We know that Travis Hunter can play football. So
I think
comparing him to these other guys, I feel like that is kind of like the, we're tailing more towards the upside, I feel like, especially at this draft cost.
I think the challenge from a football perspective is you can play part-time wide receiver, but you can't play part-time cornerback. And so
why can't you, though?
The weekly game prep, and the way that I understood it from what he did in college was, hey, during the week, he's spending his time in the room on the defensive side with the cornerbacks, and then he's got certain formations that he comes out and plays for offense. I think, and Miko, I mean, hey, help me here, but from my understanding, it's a lot easier for, here's how we're running our offense, here's the plays you're going to run, let's go attack it. And then on a weekly basis, when you're game planning, studying the film, that's when their cornerback room, because you need to be in there to understand, hey, what am I doing on a formation basis? What does this team do differently? What does this player do differently?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, I think that the hardest part about playing corner is the athletic part, and he has that. So, like, if I'm a team, and I'm not, like, I'm obviously not the one making this decision, but, like, do I want Travis Hunter? What's more valuable to me? Travis Hunter being out there on first and second down to tackle a running back, or Travis Hunter playing 80% of the offensive snaps and being able to make big plays? Like, I feel like the right team is going to understand, like, let's get him out there on offense. Let's throw him the football. And then, yeah, third down, passing situations, 2-minute, like, he can go cover their team's best guy. That's fine. That's easy. Cover 3, cover 4, like, that stuff doesn't change. Like, it's the same as it is when you're 17 to when you're, 25 in the NFL or whatever. So, like, I understand the challenges mechanically and how it could be, maybe perceived that he has to be a corner first, but I'm just not positive that is ultimately how it ends up shaking out, because he is so good on offense.
The fourth most receiving yards in the nation, Leone, with a 26% target share in his final year. I know you're still diving into rookies on your side, but just from a game theory perspective, when you first hear what we've all talked about and know he's in the 10th round, does it just seem from the outside looking in that the ceiling is worth that in the 10th round?
So, I mean, this is like such a lukewarm take, but just listening to everything, that ADP sounds about right to me. I'd probably have him closer to ADP than, I mean, I know Herzig in our current ranks is a little bit further behind on ADP, but if Amico is saying that he's the best wide receiver in the class, then the reward seems worth the risk to me at that point. This is a spot in drafts where I think that type of upside really matters and can make a big difference, while some of the veterans have shakier floors and they probably seem on paper. So, I think that makes sense. If you had told me he was like the third or fourth best wide receiver prospect, I'd be out. It's not worth risking that. I guess it comes down to as well, like, what are the odds that he's a true zero, as opposed to, understand this one half the conversation we had so far is like, what's the upside as far as like, is he gonna be a part-time player, or like if he's a full-time player, he has this upside being the best wide receiver in the class. Pinning down the odds that he's like truly a zero and just playing cornerback would be my biggest concern, and would be the one thing that, if that was higher than I expected, might sway me to say that 10th round's too early. But so far, I think that makes sense.
I'd put it around 50 to 70% that he is a part-time offensive player. And then what does that part-time offensive player mean? In my mind, it's probably he's playing some red zone formations. He maybe gets a few touchdowns out there. Those might help your score, but I wouldn't say like that's close to being a zero, because if you're only playing a certain amount of snaps and you're only playing around the goal line, your upside potential for big games is really capped. And that's where I think, So if that's at least what I'm basing off right now, based off what teams are saying, what they see him as.
Yeah, the only note I'd make, though, is sometimes these guys, it's generally not a situation exactly like this, but other situation with rookies we're worried about playing time is if they can just get on the field and show what they can do, things change very quickly as far as what the playing time expectations are. and, how many looks. If he's out there, if he can be a part-time receiver from day one and he's making splash plays, are they going to keep him a part-time wide receiver despite everything that they're saying for the rest of the season? But 50 to 70% does sound, a little bit scary if that's truly the right number.
I personally don't think it's hard to value him higher than the next tier of wide receivers going a little bit ahead of him, like Christian Kirk, Romeo Doubs, Quentin Johnson, Xavier Leggett. But when we get to the Trey Harris, Keenan Allen, Marvin Mims conversations, I feel like that's the range he fits in. So maybe I'm with you, Leone, in that I do feel like I want to be slightly ahead of ADP or at ADP. But again, it's the most polarizing player, I feel like, in early best ball. And Amico, Leone has already pointed out that where we should be taking these shots, rounds 14 through 18. I'm curious if you have any late rounders in mind that you think we should be ahead of ADP on.
Yeah, so the thing that's interesting about this receiver class to me is just that there's not a lot of guys at the top that you're super excited about. Like, I feel like we're not like super pumped about Emeka Egbuka and Luther Burden or whatever as like being the guy, guys who can come in and be alphas. But it's like a really deep class in terms of guys who can come in and contribute. So that's the benefit here. The guy that I like that is like buried in ADP, and I don't know if this means that I'm just like totally off on this guy, but Torrey Horton out of Colorado State was a big time producer the last 2 years. Really talented player, had a knee injury during the year. So it was like never really clarified what this knee injury was. I thought maybe it was like an ACL, something like that. And we were looking at him not even really playing much this year. Well, then the guy shows up to the combine. They're saying that he's only been active for like a week or two. And he's like crushing it out there. Like, he runs like a really good time. He weighs in fine, all this stuff. So I'm like, okay, this is a guy who's probably right back on that day 2 radar, probably closer to round 3 than round 2, but on the day 2 radar, and he's like a legit last round pick. Kyle Williams, I feel similarly about Washington State. He was a huge winner at the Senior Bowl. He's another guy who was good at the combine. I mean, 4.4 speed, like not crushing it like Golden was, but good enough. And a guy who has like a pretty interesting background in terms of, really good early production, then kind of fell by the wayside a little bit, and then finished strongly. So those are the 2 guys that I like the most probably at this point. And then earlier than that, I mean, there's just like a whole host of guys that are going to get drafted pretty highly, like Jalen Royals, Jack Beck, those guys who are probably going to be round 2 picks. But because they're not really as well known or as sexy, they kind of go super late in these drafts.
I did want to note that in my first season playing NCAA college football that I won the Heisman with Torrey Horton. So
hell yeah, Leone, let's go.
Keep that in mind. But as far as these late round receivers, did want to like sort of reiterate something that Herzig said in terms of the running backs being better than wide receivers here, especially pre-draft. I've just got some horror stories of previous seasons. You get these wide receivers with these analytical profiles you like. Seth Williams is a guy that sticks out. Gets drafted in the 6th round and is like, kind of dead. Post-draft, I think you can evaluate those late round receivers a little bit better based on the depth chart in front of them. Whereas the running backs, no matter where they get, that draft capital is a little bit less important as long as they can land on a roster. Injuries and attrition happen to the position and they can work their way up. So I just wanted to kind of reiterate that while you can look for these players, focus on the upside, target some of the guys that Miko's saying, I agree with Herzig that it's better to look at running back than wide receiver as far as rookies in this range.
I also love the Kyle Williams point from the Senior Bowl, because the Senior Bowl truly is when players make their name in the NFL draft. Sometimes scouts even shut off their brain, going all the way back to that fateful pandemic year where I lived with Silva and yelled at him from across the room that Mac Jones is a top 10 pick, all because Mac Jones was good at the Senior Bowl. Sometimes evaluation can be that simple to NFL scouts. For the final position here for rookies and tight ends, though, we've arguably been spoiled the last 2 years, Amico, with Sam Laporta resetting how we handle rookie tight ends after Kyle Pitts let us all down universally. And then Brock Bowers last year finishing as the tight end 2 in points per game, despite being drafted, pre-draft even, on the bubble of top 12 options. So for starters, is there even a prospect that sniffs Laporta or Bowers comp in this class?
I mean, it would be a hard no for me on Bowers, but I think Laporta is definitely in range for the guys like Tyler Warren, Colston Loveland. Like those are legit guys. Like Tyler Warren's going to come in as a top 10, top 15 pick, and he's going to play right away. You know, Colston Loveland is basically a big receiver. Like he's going to be doing the things that we want as fantasy players immediately. He's not going to be out there to block. So we definitely have guys who can piece together really valuable seasons, I think. The Bowers thing is just put that out of your mind. But I definitely think Laporta type, production is possible.
Between Loveland or what names in particular?
Loveland to me is the best guy. I mean, he's going way later than Warren. But I think like the way that he plays football is just better for fantasy. Like he's going to be in the slot. He's going to be getting the ball as a receiver. It's kind of like an Evan Ingram type player. Like he's not going to line up in line. Tyler Warren is like a legit dude who can block. Like so that's not as valuable. Even if it's more valuable for an NFL team, it's obviously not as valuable for us for fantasy. So I'm a Loveland guy if I'm just picking between those two straight up for fantasy.
And what's unique about Bowers' season, Leone, is that it also made us all forget that Ben Sinnott went as high as the 12th round among rookie tight ends last year. So where do you draw the line there? Is it worth taking the shots at their position in that range, given the obvious volatility we've seen just between those two players alone?
Yeah, I think the one thing is you want to be careful in terms of how you compare players, because we do kind of in our brains want to be like who's the Bowers this year? And last year was like, who's the Laporta this year? And Laporta was a very different prospect than Sinnott. He had better draft capital than Sinnott, and he also kind of had this extreme bull case. So it's important historically to know that the floor is quite low on the majority of these tight ends. If you go back to 2000, the number of tight ends with even 70 targets in a season as a rookie is 12. It's not very many, and you want to keep that in mind. It is a position where you can get away with not worrying about draft capital quite as much. It's obviously better, but athleticism just matters so much at the tight end position. With wide receiver, I mentioned how so much of that's baked into the draft capital that we almost don't even want to count it additionally too much. Tight end's the opposite. You really want to focus on athleticism because, as Amico said, the way the position's played is very different in terms of the guys that are good at fantasy and the guys that are good at real life. Whereas at wide receiver, that's like more of a one-to-one correlation. So it's not to say not to take chances on tight ends, but we've had a couple outliers the past handful of years in terms of really good rookie seasons. And you could say that's the start of a trend, but I still think you want to look at these guys case by case basis and keep that longer term context in mind.
How are you handling those rookie situations right now, Justin? Are you taking two or padding pre-draft and leaning into more 3 tight end construction?
Yeah, just because these are 20-round drafts pre-draft, I think it does make sense to grab 3 tight ends, especially when in the last couple rounds you can grab guys like Dalton Schultz and Zach Ertz and guys that we're pretty confident are going to be the starting tight end in their team. The way that I kind of think about rookies, I mean, an entire tight end position, for you to get really a big tight end outcome, it comes from one of two ways. Either one, that person becomes like the leading, the offense runs through them. And you can obviously saw with the Trey McBride, the Brock Bowers and such. And even if you don't get the touchdowns, just because you're the focal part of that offense, you can still have a huge season. The second is if you are actually attached to a very strong, high-powered offense. And these are some of the years that we saw where, you had Dalton, was it Dalton Schultz with the Cowboys that one year, had like a top 3 season. You have these guys that you wouldn't think of being like your elite tight ends, but they can have the seasons when they're attached to those high-powered offenses. And so for me, I I want the guys that I'm happy to draft the first rounders. I think that those, and when you think of like Colson Loveland, maybe draft in the second half of the first round and be attached to one of those stronger teams. Tyler Warren, I think if you go to the Colts, if you go to the Broncos, he actually has the potential to actually be the primary pass catcher on that team. And so those are two guys I'm happy to go for. I just don't see it as much with these others when the draft capital for, if you are going to go for someone like Arroyo or like Fannin, for in the same round or a round or two more expensive, you can at least get a much higher floor player in that we know who's going to be the starter. And you look at what Cole Kmet, Pat Fryermuth are being drafted in 166, 167. Cole Kmet with Ben Johnson on that new offense. Like, you can still tell a story that these veteran late tight ends have single season upside, that unlike other positions where we want that rookie upside because we already know what the wide receivers and running backs are going to give us, tight ends just in a new system, in a new role, they mature a little later, can still give you that upside. So a lot of my teams, they're 3 tight ends and they're grabbing some of these. I like the 2 first round rookies, but other than that, I like to go with the veteran tight ends.
Is there any other names, Amico? And we have the next 2 months of this show to bring to everyone individual positional prospect profiles, which we will. But before we leave this one with macro thoughts, are there any other final names that come to your mind at this position that people could be drafting, that could be drafted in the NFL just behind Colston?
I mean, the guy that people are saying now could sneak into the first round is Mason Taylor out of LSU. And he goes very, very late in these best ball drafts. I don't know if that's going to actually happen. But he's a guy that has NFL bloodlines. He's Jason Taylor's son. So it's a little bit easier to buy into the possibility that, A, he's actually good, and B, he could come in and be productive just because, he has a father that's kind of been through it, even if it's at a different position. Terrence Ferguson also goes really late. I don't think that he's going to make his way into round 1. I don't think that's even a question. I think he's definitely a day 2 guy. But like Leone said, you want the athletes, and he was the best athlete at the combine at that spot. So I would much rather be taking Ferguson and Taylor with a legit last round pick than I would be taking, Fannin, who goes in the 180s and didn't test well at all. So, be really picky about this, like Herzig said, I feel like.
With that being said, it brings us to the end of our show. Remember to stay tuned to the Establish the Edge feed, as we will be coming back to you weekly through the NFL draft. Amico continuing to run all the Dynasty content on that side, plus the free agency news and podcasts that are happening on the main Establish the Run feed and site as well. So until then, thanks to Leone for coming out of retirement and joining us to talk about best ball. Thanks to Herzig. Thanks to Amico. And of course, until next time, be a little bit kinder than what's required. We'll see you then.